So, when you buy a house, what are you actually buying? And when you sell it and move out, what are you allowed to take with you? This seems like a simple question, but it's at the heart of so many legal fights. And the answer all comes down to this really fascinating legal concept called a fixture. Okay, think about this for a second. You've sold your house, it's moving day. What about that really nice air conditioning unit you installed a couple years ago? The one that was a lifesaver last summer. Can you just unhook it and take it with you? Or, legally, does it now belong to the new owners? Well, the answer is way more complicated than you might think. So, the key idea here is something lawyers call a fixture. Basically, it's an object that starts out as your personal stuff, your chattel, to use the old school legal term. But because it's been attached to the property, it actually transforms and becomes part of the real estate itself. Think of a built-in bookshelf versus a freestanding one. But as we're about to see, what attached really means, well, that's where it gets tricky. To get to the bottom of this, we've got to travel back in time, all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, actually, for a classic English case that tried to set a really simple, straightforward rule for this exact problem. I want you to picture this. It's a huge factory in 1872. It's noisy, it's busy, and it is filled with hundreds of massive cast iron looms. Now, these things aren't just sitting there. To keep them from shaking all over the place, every single one is physically bolted right into the concrete floor. So what happens is the owner of the mill mortgages the property, but then he goes bankrupt. This left the court with a huge question. Were all those looms part of the factory building itself, and therefore part of the mortgage, or were they just a bunch of machines that could be sold off separately? The court came up with a test that honestly feels like pure common sense. It's called the degree of annexation test, which is just a fancy way of asking, how attached is it? And since the looms were literally bolted to the floor, the court said, yep, they've become part of the land. They're fixtures, a simple physical test. And for a while, that was that. Problem solved. Or so it seemed. But of course, technology changes, and the law has to play catch-up. So let's fast forward over 100 years to Australia, where a new bit of tech was about to make that simple rule look, well, a little outdated. This is where it gets really good. Here's the scene. We've got these huge, heavy air conditioning units on the roof of a building. They're all hooked up to the building's water pipes and the air ducts, but, and you gotta pay attention to this part, they're not actually bolted down. They're so heavy that they're just sitting there resting on their own weight. So if we're just going by that old 1872 bolted down rule, you'd think, okay, these aren't fixtures, right? I mean, they failed the test. They're just really heavy things sitting on a roof. But the court had to wonder, was that simple physical test really enough anymore? And boom, here's the big twist. Even though they weren't bolted down, the court said the air conditioners were fixtures. And in doing so, they gave us a brand new, much smarter test, the object of annexation. It's a whole new way of looking at it. The court basically asked, forget how it's attached for a second. Why was it put there? And you see how the thinking totally shifted, right? We went from that simple physical question in 1872, how bolted is it, to a much deeper question of intention. Was this thing put here to permanently improve the building? In the case of the air conditioner, it was part of a whole system designed to make the entire building work better. And that purpose, that intention, turned out to be way more important than a handful of bolts. So now we've got two big ideas, physical attachment and the purpose of the attachment. But property law loves to throw a good curveball, which brings us to a case that is, and I mean this literally, out of this world. I mean, all these cases so far are about things that people attached to a building on purpose. But what happens if the thing that gets attached, well, what if it comes from outer space? You heard that right. This isn't science fiction. It actually happened. Back in 1965, a meteorite crashed into a piece of private property in Australia, and it didn't just land there. The impact drove it deep into the soil. So the government wanted to claim it as public property, but the landowner basically said, hang on a second, that thing landed on my property. And the court's decision was clear. It belonged to the landowner. Because the meteorite was embedded in the soil, or attached to it, it had legally become part of the land itself. And this is a huge point, right? Attachment doesn't need a person with a wrench. Nature itself can do the attaching, and in the process, change what you legally own. Okay, so I get it. Bolted looms, rooftop air conditioners, space rocks, It's all fascinating stuff. But what does any of this old legal history have to do with you today, with your apartment lease or the house you're thinking of buying? Well, it turns out it matters a whole lot. So after going through 150 years of legal fights, what's the big takeaway for you? It's simple. Never, ever assume. That custom shelving you installed in your rental, that fancy smart thermostat you put in, if it's not spelled out in a contract, its fate is going to be decided by these exact principles. So the most important thing you can do, whether you're buying, selling, or renting, is put it in writing. Be specific. List what stays and what goes. Because if you don't, you're basically letting a judge decide who gets to keep your stuff. And this all leads to a really mind-bending question for our time. As our homes get smarter and more connected, what's the next frontier for fixtures? Think about it. If a home's entire lighting system, its security, its climate control, is all run by one deeply integrated software system, could that software be considered a fixture? It isn't physically bolted down, but the intention is definitely to improve the house permanently. It's a wild question, and it's one our laws are going to have to answer very, very soon.